Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and welcome to the body's Politic, Architecture and the Modern Subject. I'm Maura Lucking.
I'm Will Davis.
We're sharing a small mic, I'm sorry. We're both second-year doctoral students here at AUD in the Critical Studies in Architecture program. And we're thrilled to have the opportunity to bring so many brilliant scholars, colleagues, and friends into Westwood for a weekend of research presentations and what will surely be generative and provocative conversations about what we really feel is a core problem in our practice. The attempt to differentiate and historicize the epistemological goals and material practices of subject formation in the modern period.
So I'd like to take a moment to thank our guests for traveling to join us, as well as to recognize the organizational and intellectual effort that went into the event over the past year, both from fellow doctoral students and core faculty. Click my fingers right now. Dana Cuff, Michael Osman, and Sylvia Levin, each of whom were instrumental in helping us articulate the ambitions of this weekend.
Okay, stop. Thank you to the department as a whole for their support, especially our interim chair, Neil Denari, and vice chair, Heather Roberge, and to Dana Burkhalter, without whom this weekend would simply be a poorly drawn budget proposal. And thank you also to the School of Arts and Architecture and to City Lab, which is AUD's research center, for those who are with us today, for contemporary urbanism, all of whose participation in this symposium represents a commitment to the role of research and scholarship within architectural praxis, for which we are extremely grateful.
Okay, so the call for papers issued for this symposium encapsulates a number of questions and discourses that have preoccupied our own seminars in recent years, particularly around the role of political thought within the field and the ways in which it might be appropriate or even possible for scholars to assert themselves in our current political climate. What is our agency? And what, in turn, is the agency of our historical actors? Under modernity, architecture self-consciously enrolled itself in the pantheon of power's tools, explicitly deployed to create subjects, whether citizens, populations, or neoliberal individuals. How are we then to pass the role of architecture's professional, cultural, and tectonic configurations in relation to these institutions, and how might these contingencies be made historically rich and productive?
Our field, and program in particular, brings together individuals from diverse academic backgrounds, which has given rise to the reassessment of canon formation in architecture at the same time as historiographical consideration of our own methodological and disciplinary formation. It's humbling and exciting to bring together such an amazing group with whom to wrestle through these anxiety-producing questions this weekend.
We begin the weekend with our first keynote, Lisa Uddin, and we'll spend the afternoon tomorrow with Zeynep Shelek-Alexander, followed by 3 graduate panels concerning epistemologies, economies, and polities, respectively. We hope also that you'll join us after the lecture this evening to celebrate the opening of Sylvia Levin's exhibition, The Duck and the Document, at the Sayar Gallery.
So without further ado, I'm going to bring up our colleague, Gary Fox, who will introduce Lisa. Thank you for coming.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Can I go without the mic? I'd like to echo William and Maura's comments in thanking you all for coming out tonight from nearby and from afar. And of course, I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Lisa Uddin, the first of 2 keynotes to frame this weekend's proceedings. Lisa Uddin is an assistant professor of art history and visual culture. Okay. And visual culture? I don't know. At Whitman College. She received her PhD from the program in Visual and Cultural Studies at the University of Rochester. Broadly, her work considers what she describes as relations between normative U.S. visual culture and the built environment. I, as well as some of the others in the audience tonight, first came to know of Lisa's work in the context of the Society of Architectural Historians Conference in Pasadena last year. There she presented a paper titled Radical Shit, Countercultural Autonomy in the Composting Toilet, where she examined a composting toilet installed at the so-called autonomous house produced by Sim Vanderen and the Experimental Architectural Studio at Berkeley. Here she took the toilet, and particularly the human and non-human agents participating in its production, as a key site for both the construction of countercultural possibilities and the revelation of their limitations. This research, in some perhaps parenthetical way, will figure into her current project for a book tentatively titled Survival Modes, Blackness, Biopolitics, and California Modernism, which considers what she identifies as the terms, textures, and futurity of Black life as it intersected with modernist discourses in California. Her book, Zoo Renewal, White Flight, and the Animal Ghetto, published in 2015 by the University of Minnesota Press, examines discourses around the renovation of animal exhibits in the 60s and 70s against struggles over urban decay, suburban growth, and post-war American whiteness. Against what we might describe as a teleological view of the zoo's progressive modernization, she instead identifies a, quote, signifying relay between race and species, wherein discourse around zoo renewal becomes imbricated with cultures and politics of urban renewal, and particularly the emergence of the city as an object of fear. Electing the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., and the Zoological Society of San Diego's 2 campuses as case studies amid these broader discourses, her work takes up oral histories, institutional correspondence, and landscapes and architectures of animal exhibits as her primary texts. This method allows her to ask, quote, what would it mean to appreciate how cities pulse, not only with the product of the human hand and mind, but with a multiplicity of organisms, of unfamiliar agential corporalities that have supported and challenged the category of the human at every turn. I'm not sure if we can or would want to describe her methodology as decidedly post-humanist, but perhaps we can say that there is at least a decentering of the human subject or a distancing in her work, which affords, in some sense, a critical possibility for understanding the construction of subjectivity in the context of its fuller political, cultural, and material origins and manifestations. Reading relations between zoo renewal and non-human actors non-anthropocentrically, this work examines the formation of racialized and gendered identities, particularly post-war whiteness, vis-a-vis architectures and landscapes. In this sense, Professor Uddin's work represents a new discursive formation in broader architectural scholarship practices, and in the context of the symposium, offers possible ways forward in regard to the historical question: how have built environments produced subjectivities and identities? Please join me in welcoming Professor Uddin and thanking her for her contribution this weekend.
Let me get set up here. I might need some help. Yeah. Do we have a light for this guy?
Yeah, let's get you. There we go.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It is always weird to hear what you do spoken back to you, but assuring that it's legible and useful. So thank you very much. Other thanks to the symposium organizers and Maura in particular for organizing all the essentials and executing all the important essentials that were important because they allowed me to be here to share this information with you, and vice versa. I'm also grateful for what happened this afternoon. Talk and struggle and reassurance and laughs around the state of architectural history and theory as a PhD pursuit, and what it means to write, and what it means to pick a research object, and how to think over the long term about questions that can seem overwhelming at times. So that was wonderful. Thanks also to Zainab and Michael, two new friends, I hope, that were part of the session this afternoon. Tonight I'm sharing some ideas and histories and images that are germane to my own thinking, but also attempting to spark connections to the vast, complicated problem of architecture and the modern subject. Some of those connections that I'm attempting to spark will be on you to sort of fan the flames. Some of them are my own to make, so I hope we get a chance to talk about some of them after. Start here and here. Select scholarship on American architecture and urban planning highlights both as uneven projects of white racial formation that aim to secure the Enlightenment human subject and police modernity's others. This work has begun to complicate a vigorous narrative about the residual progressivism and or full-blown democratizing powers of architectural modernism at mid-century. Studies that have sustained my own doubts about modernism's itineraries, self-conscious or otherwise, include George Lipsitz's account of westward settlement, restrictive covenants, and urban renewal as white spatial imaginaries replete with exchange values and ideals of purity and homogeneity. Diane Harris's analysis of the post-war single-family detached house is another important insight, scrutinizing designs as an apparatus of mid-century American whiteness, more quotidian and potent than the avant-garde plans of high modernism. Eric Avila's research on the freeway is another, a story of how a modernist urban form nourished white racial identities, pitched towards suburban sensibilities, while also inadvertently facilitating identities that cohered around insurgents against that form. Additionally, geographer Rashad Shabazz has made a powerful critique of modernism as urban incarceration, analyzing how mechanisms of constraint, built into and practiced within city spaces like public housing, constituted both a figurative and literal prison-like environment for Black people living in Chicago's South Side. A robust reading of this and allied literature suggests that modernist architectural planning discourse in the United States, modernist architectural and planning discourse in the United States, worked not only as a form of aesthetic and symbolic violence against minoritized people who disidentified with templates of white bourgeois heteropatriarchy, but also, following Michel Foucault, as a built form of biopower, exercised through the unit of the population and along lines of difference that negated the life chances of those people. Other stories can and should be told, and were, about how these forms of aesthetic and symbolic violence, and the biopolitics of which they are an expressive part, shape the life chances of non-human beings. In my book on the revitalization of U.S. zoos in the 60s and 70s, I embarked on some of that work by tracking a shifting design model of iron-barred cages to multi-species, multi-acre open-air enclosures. Historians were already well-practiced at situating this shift within a narrative of wildlife conservation discourse. For them, the change signaled a responsiveness to the escalating destruction of natural environments and the threats to species worldwide. My account located it more firmly within the highly mediated climate of urban decline that by the 1960s had once again made the central city into an object of fear and concern for many Americans. Focused on the historically specific inflections of feeling bad at the zoo, and I got an earful throughout this project. I always feel bad when I go to the zoo. I tracked how new zoo makers across the U.S. proposed and then built renewed forms of public life as a white liberal remedy to feeling bad about American cities. This was how I came to understand how architectural modernism was implicated in longer histories of humanist world building that engage non-human animals in their living spaces as raw material for racial self-discovery to various degrees of success. The process was multifaceted and mutable, reliant on two-dimensional images and text, and validated through the substance of three-dimensional spaces and species embodiments. At certain points during renewal, reformers linked their animals to non-white people who fell well below the ideal, imbuing non-human creatures with objectionable traits, forms of behavior, and living conditions associated with racial and ethnic minorities. By depicting existing pathways blighted by iron railings and excessive concrete, for example, the National Zoo's Master Plan report of the early 1970s, like other zoo reports of its time, drew visual comparisons to the dehumanizing neighborhoods occupied by poor African Americans. Surely, as these photographs implied, the zoo could do better for its charges. The tuberculosis and toxoplasmosis afflicting certain animals in the collection provided more reason to link the problems of the federal city's zoo to those of other communities in crisis. At other points of institutional pride and regeneration, the new zoo makers suffused animal imagery with the codes of whiteness, figuring animals as proto-humanist subjects in full kinship with a zoo-going public whose post-war whiteness was also under construction. So, for example, when the Zoological Society of San Diego debuted a new sprawling gorilla enclosure as a matter of keeping up with our gorillas, they inverted the historical blackness of the primates by constructing the troupe as a normative, upwardly mobile family worth watching and emulating in the vein of keeping up with the Joneses. At 210 feet long and 80 feet deep, the moated enclosure was a rustic retreat, surfaced with kikuyu grass and semi-decomposed granite found in the neighboring hillside. The addition of oak trees cut back to sturdy branches and a 2-foot deep swimming pool were additional refinements that curators, quote, feared the gorillas might not respect, but whose adaptation surprised everyone. Zoo photographers displayed the residents engaging in vigorous, wholesome outdoor play, while a final image reconstructed a gorilla's view of the park, and a white subjectivity rooted in the power to observe others risk-free. These racial representations were neither secure nor particularly self-conscious, confirming the riotousness of racial meaning that John Hartigan identifies as the stuff of American public culture more broadly. Iterable and operational through inference, accident, and the uncanny, they were nonetheless pivotal to the reworking of a bourgeois urbanism that passed for generic, that counted for what was most American what was most human in American life, and that had always been highly racialized. This was the same urbanism that since the mid-19th century privileged the presence of the white bourgeoisie in park space, a group that fashioned themselves as a universal type, sometimes to the physical exclusion of other people, and other times in ways that set the terms of what inclusion could be, maintaining decorum, dressing well, looking intently at nature, and so forth. And it was the same urbanism that proved desirable to those who, while not comfortably located in that racial profile, sought out such distinction all the same or were drafted into it. In collaboration with participant animals, the new zoo makers renewed this type, and in doing so demonstrated a preoccupation with the question of whiteness in the U.S. of the 1960s and 70s. Writing a counter-history of post-war zoo design and the urbanism it produced meant thinking outside of the human, while in the midst of critiquing the humanist normativities that comprise the longue durée of zoo modernism. I asked, and here I think I'm going to double up here, what it would mean to appreciate how cities pulse, it bears repeating, not only with the product of the human hand and mind, as the post-war urban reformer Charles Abrams once phrased it, but with a multiplicity of organisms, of unfamiliar, agential corporealities that have supported and challenged the category of human at every turn and its record of civic decline and progress. I asked what it would mean to feel for that pulse, taking it not as the cue to forge an expanded liberal democratic pluralism, a case of critters are people too, but as the feeling of the already interspecies character of the city and the starting point for social and environmental justice. These questions, which I'm still asking, owe much to environmental feminist studies, also known as the feminist posthumanities, also known as new materialism. From Donna Haraway's description of the reworlding potentials of companion species relationships, to Karen Barad's strong critiques of physical and corporeal matter as passive substance, to Jane Bennett's eco-political theory of thing power. Just to add, that's not exactly true. My zoo project did not emerge directly from Barad and Bennett, and I think if I was reading them at the time, it would have been a different project, but it's certainly where my thinking is at now. What recommends this body of work is its capacity to notice and articulate the productive force of flesh, fur, metal, and material of all kinds and intensities, not as exploitable and extractable resources, but as earthly, everyday relations of care, curiosity, collaboration, struggle, and obligation. Not as flat component parts, but as vibrant agentic stuff in which human ontologies and epistemologies are entangled and made possible. And it is through such noticing and articulation of entanglement that scholars, artists, architects, and activists can offer more capacious analyses of and interventions into the ecological, economic, and social present. At the same time, any turn towards the muddied ties between the human and the non-human does well to revisit the nausea I felt at an environmental humanities conference in 2015, when a white PhD student asked what would happen if we recognized amidst the Black Lives Matter movement that life is matter. His question received murmurs of appreciation, while I wondered why my stomach dropped. The suggestion that those of us in the room could address the suffering of Black people while also bracketing off Black from life was the locus of my discomfort. This was, to my stomach, a call to erase a contemporary location of Black being and becoming as an exercise in moving beyond the human, when in fact the Blackness of this and other locations is the metric through which the human itself in the colonial West, its features, its capacities, its beyonds, has been determined, at least since the 15th century with the development of the transatlantic slave trade. This is to say that animality, objectness, and thingliness are major Western categories and ontologies of Black life, that Black life has long counted and existed as matter of various sorts. Scholars like Saidiya Hartman and Zakiya Iman Jackson, who work in the Black radical tradition, know and name this well. Frantz Fanon also named it when he wrote, "I came into the world imbued with the will to find meaning in things, my spirit filled with a desire to attain the source of the world, and then I found that I was an object in the midst of other objects." For me, the challenge is keeping Blackness and scenarios of entanglement together in the same analytical field, such that we do not relegate Black life to identity regimes that are overdue for retirement along with the humanist figure of modern Western man, nor do we limit ourselves to making often futile bids to recognize Black humanity from the vantage point of a centrist liberalism. How can we speak of, historicize, and facilitate a Black non-humanism? What might that look and feel like as a cultural practice, a product, and a politics? Fred Moten identifies a version of these questions as the problem of Blackness itself. Alexander Wahile frames it as habeas viscus, an articulated and enfleshed assemblage of the non-human, born of political violence. Writing on architecture, Mario Gudin calls it dark space. My own inquiries and ideas come from a racially ambiguous body, coupled with a family history of post-war intercontinental migration and an Islamic last name, which has produced for me a desire to work, make kin, and be well, despite the myriad conjugations of American whiteness that irk some and kill others. Tonight, I want to invite us to keep these concerns in mind as we consider the sense of urban place that flowed from the collective life and times of the Black Panther Party. I have two goals in mind in making this invitation. The first is to highlight some ways that this sense of urban place, which we might call Black Panther Oakland, was an effect of human, non-human entanglements as they manifest in both the physical and imagined spaces of the city. To paraphrase Donna Haraway, paraphrasing Bruno Latour, Black Panther Oakland was never human, at least neither only nor firmly. Rather, it was an urbanism designed for Black survival, and whose formations of Blackness de-territorialized the city as exclusively human and humanist. Here, Blackness and its survival materialized not in the vulgar reinscriptions of Western European subjectivities and spaces, but instead, for example, in the serving of free milk, bacon, and eggs and grits to school-aged children, in party leaders Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton's handling of a Colt 45 and shotgun, respectively, and in following the behaviors of a big cat that, according to Stokely Carmichael in 1966, never strikes back until he's back so far into the wall, he's got nothing to do but spring out. Yeah, and when he springs, he does not stop. Such proactive and discerning practices of enmeshment with food, firearms, and animal exemplars were operative to Panther urbanism, or if you will, Panther modernism, and the worlds it strained to enact. But they remain a dormant thread of much BPP historiography to date. They also remain well outside the purview of many animal studies, which continue to juxtapose a time of authentic human-non-human relations before capitalist modernity to the radical distance after it. I take, for example, animal historian Brett Mizell's point that the free-ranging pig was once a common feature of cities before its mid-century relocation to industrial slaughterhouses and confinement to grocery stores and signage. But on what grounds and whose bodies did this conception of freedom and confinement rely? To what extent were more authentic human relationships with early urban pigs always already mediated? And what deliberate, unplanned, or forced relations survived into the 20th century, if not towards real pigs, then certainly real companion species, pests, and vermin? There are other urban practices in the party's history that are ripe for analysis along non-humanist lines. From the self-governing communes known as Panther Pads, to the rallies at Defremery Park, to free pest control, shoes and clothing, to land banking vacant lots, to boycotting anti-black liquor stores and markets. How the Panthers' perceptions of and interventions into urban place routinely breached the normative barriers of human being and becoming vis-a-vis their physical and psychic intimacy with critters, commodities, and other non-human objects is the question at hand. So my focus tonight will mostly be on some representative examples of that breaching as it appeared in the graphic output of the party. Recognizing their function as both testimony and a paper weapon, we can approach these examples as descriptions of East Bay urban life in the late 1960s and early 70s, while also asking how they mobilized Black Oaklanders towards other urban futures. My second goal tonight is to make a claim about entanglement as a necessary and desirable condition for the ongoing work of rethinking modernism. This is my larger and still, as I signaled this afternoon, unfolding project, flagged by these two photographs and that bookmark some of my directions. The first is a 1966 black and white photograph taken by architectural and urban photographer Harry Drinkwater in Los Angeles. In it, designer and fellow Black Angelino John Smith sits in the living area of the John Lautner-designed Chemosphere House, for which Smith won the bid to interior design. The second is a photograph published in the annual report of the American Cement Corporation, documenting Watts-based artists Noah Purifoy and Judson Powell's installation of their post-rebellion exhibit, 66 Signs of Neon, at an annual meeting on building better cities. I want to consider the entanglements of Black Panther Oakland as one installment in a history of blackness during and after California modernism, as it played out in architectural and urban design discourses, and whose questions read as follows. How did blackness intersect with and inhabit a region marked by, as design historian Wendy Kaplan has described it, an affinity for light and brilliant color, an openness to Asian and Latin influences, and an embrace of fluid spaces and cross-disciplines? What role did design play in the reproduction and transformations of blackness in the long 1960s at the level of designer, concept, materials, technology, and user? More expansively, what forms of blackness held sway for whom and how in the years following state highway and neighborhood redevelopment projects, the emergence of deindustrialized landscapes, mass incarceration, and utopic countercultures? In other words, in examining the Black Panther Party sense of urban place, I aim to offer another story of California modernism that might center blackness as an ulterior dimension of its formations, its refusals, and its residues. This is not a "did Black lives matter" to California modernists question, but rather, how did the matter and mattering of Black life, circa 1966, shape the trajectories of a regional modernism that became an enduring formulation of the American dream? It is a question that insists on embodied, embedded, asymmetrical, and unstable relations between the human and the non-human all the way through. It's a question that seeks to rematerialize our understanding of race without reducing it to biological or spiritual essence or class. And it's a question that makes the affirmative and necessary move to engage Black life and the good life in the same time and place, rather than the all too familiar pattern of ghettoizing or fetishizing the former. These are the kinds of framings required for any feminist, eco-socialist, and anti-racist cultural history, and perhaps architectural history. The team who recently produced an immersive walking tour in conjunction with the Oakland Museum of California's recent exhibition, All Power to the People, Black Panthers at 50, know something about these frames and their potential. Run through an online platform called Detour, which creates GPS location-based content, their terms, that is operable via your mobile phone, the tour animates North Oakland's Santa Fe neighborhood, where Newton and Seal were radicalized as college students and young Black men, and where they initiated the movement for Black Power. This is not the only BPP cartography to use mixed and digital media, but Detour's version intimates a loose method for understanding entanglement that tacks somewhere between, quite vaguely, Michel de Certeau's reflections on ground-level spatial practice and Anna Singh's ethnography of precarious mushroom economies and ecologies under late capitalism. Last January, with my earbuds in place, I was prompted to walk along streets and intersections, sit on school steps, purchase and taste baked goods, sweet potato pie, touch plants from private gardens, and sample berries and public art in community gardens. These actions, while planned, felt uncoerced, and took place while I listened to the archived and current voices of former Panthers, grooved to the music of the Lumpen, the party's funk band, and learned from the area activists and educators. The tour moved me through different media, precincts, and temporalities with impressive agility and a capacity to complicate any inkling of Oakland as a secure backdrop or resource for Black revolution. The Panthers' legacies are too fragile for such an account, and my odd assemblage of human and non-human tour guides were wise to this fact, a point that sprung to life when I was invited to simultaneously experience the sidewalks of Newton's political awakening with those of hyper-gentrification by reading passages of Chairman Mao's Little Red Book, accessible from a little free library, while also heeding the proliferation of Subarus in the neighborhood as an index of moneyed white bodies. Entanglements, indeed. My interpretations of graphic art made by and for the Black community aspire to the non-comprehensive, ambulatory, and sensory modes of the Detour tour. Thinking about modes of distribution, most images were initially shared through the party's newspaper, the Black Panther Black Community News Service, its original full title, which had 537 editions between 1967 and 1980. This tabloid-sized two-color periodical was heavily illustrated and produced through inexpensive printing techniques like photostats, black and white photographic copies, materials like pressed-down type, adhesive textures and patterns, and offset lithography. Described by one party member at the height of its popularity as the flesh and blood, the sweat and tears of our people, the paper was the party's primary recruitment tool, an important source of income, and a weekly chronicle of the movement. The graphic art therein traveled beyond the paper proper. Back page posters were frequently reprinted separately as larger 23 by 15-inch posters and wheat pasted around urban neighborhoods in runs of 10 to 20,000 nationally. As Douglas related to Erica Doss in 1993, and as signaled through these images, the work's optimum placement was on the walls, in storefront windows, on fences, doorways, telephone poles and booths, passing buses, alleyways, gas stations, barbershops, beauty parlors, laundromats, liquor stores, as well as the huts of the ghetto. I love this list because it remaps the city as an expansive and fugitive gallery of vernacular radicalized Blackness, one that flourished between the holes of more formal urban spaces, including the spaces authorized by the Party for Black insurgents, such as the Alameda County Courthouse and Merritt College. The graphics traveled as buttons and greeting cards, too, items available for inexpensive purchase and incorporation into the everyday lives of the community. But at 139,000 copies sold per week, a really conservative estimate, the generous ones are up to 400,000, the paper became the primary channel for these images and an object of impressive circulation in its own right. Oh, this was to illustrate where they went. I missed that. But you can see here an image from the Panther newspaper of a Panther poster likewise here. They got around. Once printed, the paper was transported to central distribution in the Fillmore district in San Francisco, where it was packed into boxes by region and BPP offices for eventual air shipment, usually on United Airlines bulk rate discounts. Destinations included New York, New Haven, Raleigh, Detroit, Boston, Baltimore, Chicago, Seattle, Los Angeles, to name a few. According to former party member and current archivist Billy X. Jennings, this was a weekly Wednesday night social event, with every Panther in the Bay Area coming to help get the paper out, as well as students from the Black student unions of Merritt and Laney colleges and San Francisco State University, and students from UC Berkeley, SF City College, and area high schools. To sell the paper, you had to be at least 9 years of age. In addition to getting the paper out through a network of people and pathways, the party sought to get it into the hands of routine readers. The paper had always advertised subscriptions, and by the early 70s fostered its readership through door-to-door subscription drives and the slogan, "Subscribe to Survive." By signing up with the news service, readers were offered the possibility of staying alive by staying informed, funding the community survival programs implemented by the party, and becoming participants in working out the best means and ways of solving the problems of our people, of Black people and poor people, end quote. What I'm sketching out here is a well-oiled process by which Black life was activated within and as Black Panther Oakland via the reproduction and movement of inked paper across and between city spaces. It's an object-centered account thus far, a story of activist art in the mechanical age, activist art in the age of mechanical reproduction, to badly paraphrase Walter Benjamin, or the newsprint is the message, following Marshall McLuhan, but one that also attempts to keep the flesh and blood, sweat, and tears in focus as much as the material's affinities for reproducibility. Ethical Black nonhumanisms and the urbanisms to which they might point cannot be so technologically deterministic that they obfuscate their embodiments. Efforts to make the paper physically repugnant are worth mentioning then. In August 1970, the San Diego field office of the FBI's counterintelligence program proposed contaminating the newspaper's printing facility with scatol, a chemical powder known to duplicate the stench of feces. The aim was to render the building uninhabitable and stop the paper's publication. Similar proposals were actually carried out in other U.S. cities with sprays of the chemical as well as urine directly onto the paper in an effort to make it unsellable. These moves to materially defile the paper underline the periodical's power for those who produced, distributed, and consumed its pages across networks in Oakland and well beyond, but also the vulnerability of the Blackness that emerged from it. Returning to this specific image, formatted as both a back page poster in the newspaper and a larger recolored version, which I'm also showing here, we can see another example of how the flattening procedure of mechanical printing did not, in fact, entail a separation from the flesh and blood, sweat, and tears. Designed by Emory Douglas, who I realize I mentioned earlier but didn't tell you who he was, the party's Minister of Culture and art director for the paper, the composition is a bold collage of disparate elements that, assembled, suggest tangible layers. These include images appropriated from the mainstream news, ones sourced from party photographers, as well as Douglas's defined black line drawing, evocative of German expressionist woodcuts, but also traditional African art. And a contrast and layering of patterns that also reads as African. This is a combination of media that displays the virtuosic duet between artists' labors and materials over, say, a handling of the latter. The imaginative repetition of these elements over the paper's output, the photo cutouts especially, is some kind of indication of a capacity to call out to Douglas and work with him. And what of the semiotic combination? A woman stands in the room's middle ground, on top of a cracked table, and with an empty glass and a receipt for her monthly rent. Her facial expression and stance are defensive but resolute as she confronts the rats that surround her and move through assorted holes. The framing text above the scene confirms that the woman-rat relationship is hostile, ongoing, and at the cost of caring for her children. It reads, "When I spend more time fighting the rats than taking care of my children, you know it makes me realize that I have a right to kill the greedy slumlords who force me to live in these inhuman conditions." Below is point number 4 of the party's 10-point platform and program, penned first in 1966, whose demand for decent housing fit for shelter of human beings locates this image in the struggle to keep working class and poor Black Oaklanders alive and well over multiple generations. As a biopolitics from below, or what Beatrice da Costa and Kavita Phillip have loosely framed as tactical biopolitics, the image resists systemic violence against Blacks who spatially and taxonomically register above the rat only through their own determination. The rat was understood and experienced as everyday vermin, but Douglass and his comrades used it to represent the remote human enemies of Black liberation as well. President Richard Nixon, Attorney General Mitchell, Chicago Mayor Richard Daley, the FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, for example. This mixing of the real and figurative animal was also part of the party's interaction with pigs. By 1970, it was common parlance to refer to the police, as pigs. As in one BPN story whose text reads, "Richmond is a classic example of how the pigs run amok daily and do their dirty work with nothing done about it. The harassment is of such a nature that the brothers and sisters on the streets get stopped by the pigs and questioned and searched and subjected to all sorts of insults and physical abuse." This rhetoric of dirty pigs running wild in an East Bay city, or Douglass's 1968 cartoon of federal pigs hanging from a lynching tree, support historian Donna Murch's argument that the Panthers in Northern California were partly a byproduct of migration. For Murch, the radicalism of Bay Area Black power, from critiques of state violence to agitation for relevant education to the redistribution of wealth, was an integration of, quote, the shared memory of a Southern rural past with the possibilities of the urban present. This East Bay Southern diaspora, what Murch describes as a coastal extension of the South, is discernible in the party's symbol of the panther, borrowed from a rural civil rights organization in Loudness County, Alabama, and it is discernible in the more elaborate deployment of the pig, an animal that was designed to resonate with new recruits and state officials alike. As Newton explained in his memoir, quote, "The Black community can relate to the true characteristics of the pig because most of us come from rural backgrounds and have observed the nature of pigs. Many of the police, too, are hired right out of the South and are familiar with the behavior of pigs." Douglass was certainly familiar with them, and not only through his Southern ties. Born in the Black ghetto of Grand Rapids, Michigan, to parents with Oklahoma and Georgia roots, he moved to San Francisco as a boy with his mother, eventually settling in what biographer Elton Fax described in '77 as a squalid section of the Fillmore district. At 15 years of age and after arrests for minor infractions, Douglass drew a 9-month sentence for truancy and fighting that confined him to Log Cabin Ranch, a juvenile detention facility 48 miles south of the city. There, Douglass was tasked with taking care of the farm's pigs and keeping the pig pen clean. "I had become an expert on the way pigs look and act," he recalled years later. Early displays of that expertise are reminiscent of livestock portraiture or butcher's illustrations from agricultural pasts. Douglass's fourth effort at representing the pig marked a turn to the grotesque that by December 1967 had become a hybrid human-animal caricature. This one. "What is a pig?" reads this headline, and answers with a satirical drawing of a putrid bipedal beast with a salivating scowl that, in this case, masquerades as the victim of an unprovoked attack. Though the pig predates the party's iconography of white supremacy and was depicted by other Panther artists and East Bay allies, Douglass's mature versions gave Oaklanders bracing fantasies of Black retaliation and perspective on the magnitude of their subjugation. They linked local police with armed forces, politicians and national governments complicit with U.S. imperialism. They aligned Panther activism with other decolonization struggles worldwide, and they spatialized race in peculiar ways. In this image, for example, produced in the wake of the Apollo 11 mission, pigs take the form of both a rocket and U.S. soldiers colonizing the moon through a renewed slave economy that removes Black urbanites from planet Earth. The sky is alarmingly red, the moon's surface is severely pitted, and the stench of anti-Blackness carries through the flies buzzing around the porcine oppressors. A second Apollo-inspired image from the same paper edition removes Black people entirely, repeating histories of white settlement and residential segregation for the space age. Regardless of geography, Douglass's pigs flipped the script of black non-humanization as a condition of killability, or, in Party's terms, offing the pig. Visual simplicity was key to this process, often rendered in a few lines. Few pigs had pupils in their eyes, and many were depicted with their eyes closed. The starkness of figuration became a point of experimentation in itself, as in this image where pigs appeared as white negative space vis-a-vis chromatic blackness, like the forensic chalk outlines of once living humans. Sometimes Douglas skipped animal figuration altogether. The button brandished by this self-possessed freedom fighter, for example, reads, "For every pork chop there is a frying pan," echoing what Panther historian Reginald Mayer heard children from the breakfast program singing earlier that year. "We want pork chops, off the pigs." Threat to the community was abstracted and neutralized into a hot meal. The requisite footnote here is that ingesting the pig, even at this conceptual level, would have resonated unevenly across U.S. urban black neighborhoods, including West Oakland. The Nation of Islam, who had a presence in the form of Temple 26B in West Oakland and a readership of its weekly newspaper, Mr. Muhammad Speaks, also discussed pig consumption, but not as a practice of community survival, or not in the same way at least. In his 1972 publication, How to Eat to Live, Book 2, Elijah Muhammad argued that the pig was a mass of small worms that the naked eye cannot detect. They're very elaborate descriptions of exactly what a pig is in worm terms. And the cause of much sickness across African American people, despite a history of eating the animal under slavery and those medical, health, and industry officials that still approve of it. For observant Muslims, pigs were best left outside black bodies. I'll turn now to two images that indicate an aesthetic shift away from abstraction, and so another formulation of the materialist intimacies we're considering tonight. The first piece, attributed to Panther artist Gail Dixon, who was known at the time as Asali, presents a detailed physical and psychic picture of racialized poverty. By detailed, I mean naturalistic pencil and ink drawing, designed to accurately reflect the living conditions of black Oaklanders as a part of the process of revolt. Such became the pedagogy of the revolutionary artist, as outlined by New York Panther artist Brad Brewer, who stated in 1970, "There is no time to be abstract," a reference to bourgeois artists whose leisure and decadence produced their non-realism. Here we see a boy who is full in his corporeality, insofar as he is shirtless, and the contours of his physical body are well developed through line and shading, not to mention the folds of his pants. He sits in cramped quarters before chipped plaster walls that expose wood lath, with his elbow resting on a radiator whose heat must not be on, if it ever was. The boy's furrowed expression is directed towards an enormous cockroach crossing a framed real estate advertisement for large luxury homes with a view, a picture accented with a light green ink wash and tilted to highlight the disjuncture of its current location. Text above the image elaborates, "Last night I dreamt all my friends came over to see my new room and play in my yard. But I sleep in the kitchen with my sisters, and there are rats in the lot out back." A more vibrant green offers a response to these notably unrealistic housing dreams, animating the flyer that publicizes one of the party's survival programs, which used federal government aid to provide high-quality housing for black and poor communities. The flyer also advertises Seal's candidacy for mayor and Elaine Brown's for councilwoman. Both Seal and Brown received widespread support from Oakland's black working class and poor, partly fueled by the candidates' visits to people's homes to discuss issues and distribute campaign literature. So it is strange, but not arbitrary, that the warped wooden floorboard appears curled upwards in a posture of readerly attention, a hint of the agential realism posited by Barad, in which an always shifting relational materiality is the process through which the world is made and remade. Barad writes, "All bodies, not merely human bodies, come to matter through the world's iterative intra-activity, its performativity. This is true not only of the surface or contours of the body, but also the body in the fullness of its physicality." Dixon's image, which of course is not Dixon's in the sense of a single authorship or ownership, reconstructs a spatial imaginary and lived reality of the city that is seething with a fullness between and within such bodies. Hers, which is not hers alone, is an unrestrained and critical bodying of West Oakland that helped cultivate a political solution to the nasty stuff of daily urban living. In his later work for the paper, Douglas also designed with an aesthetic realism that reached beyond and below the human to depict environmental hazards familiar to his community. Here, a robust roach scales rotting wood walls, as if approaching the ear canal of a girl whose sunken-in features and tensed hands evoke something of the exoskeletal body of the insect itself. The red wash used in the girl's patterned dress also connects her body to that of the roaches, while gesturing toward the sickled red blood cells afflicting people of African descent, and for which the party tested as part of another survival program. Meanwhile, photo cutouts depicting congressional candidate Shirley Chisholm in mid-speech and the smiling face of a child, presumably fed by the party's breakfast program, underscore the value of realism for a sense of urban place that is supportive of Black life. More lifelike than any other element of the composition, and in direct conversation with the broken plate for the child and spoon for Chisholm, the photographs stress survival as nutritious food and access to it as much as the vote. Voting matters less for its authentication of Black people's humanity than for its role in ensuring the health of a population engulfed in physical decay and food scarcity. By way of conclusion, I will return to another image by former party photographer Stephen Shames and Michel Foucault, the latter, if only because the Panther's sense of urban place, considered along the lines of entanglement I have discussed here, might cohere around a notion not of Black power, but of Black biopower. Consider some of the design and use history of this house, described by Jennings as the heartbeat of the party. The yard worked as a security buffer where party members would meet visitors to ask their business. The front door was fortified with steel plates and painted black so as not to be noticed. The day room alongside the front hall featured a security guard standing watch on the street and seated visitors until they were received. A TV room doubled as a weapons storage facility. The basement was finished for target practice. There were tunnel dugouts and sandbags to protect against attacks, but also a generous kitchen used for Southern home-cooked meals and a backyard with a barbecue pit and barbells. Upstairs produced the paper. Out front occasionally hosted trucks for food giveaways. Meanwhile, there was this presence of Mojo's dog and the lawn care assemblage of Mojo, Mower, and Mode. Now consider how Foucault's idea of biopower might speak obliquely to this survival space, which was chosen because it was located in the residential hub of West Oakland's Black community, and not one of the many exposed storefront offices that were isolated from it. Conceptualized as modernity's program of differentiating between forms of life worth promoting and forms that pose threats to desirable populations, we know that Foucault's notion of biopower had nothing to say about non-human animals, let alone non-human things, and too much to say about man as an aggregated and subjugated object. Wahileye, for example, has forcefully argued that while Foucault's concept was formulated as a critique of human subjectivity, it can also end up strengthening it by ignoring, quote, the minuscule movements, glimmers of hope, scraps of food, the interrupted dreams of freedom found in those spaces deemed devoid of full human life. For Wahileye, this is not a call to retrieve patterns of resistance and agency that belong to the Enlightenment tradition. Instead, it demands a recalibration towards the different genres of the human, amidst biopower's flexing. I am holding out for those humanities, which tonight I've called Black non-humanism, the ones that register through minuscule movements and warrant close study precisely for how they confuse both the normalizing functions of Western humanism and a biopolitical logic of looming or choreographed extinction. In other words, this house was not a home as many Americans have known and wanted, nor did this house entail imminent death for its users. As a resistance to and reworlding of disparate yet interdependent forms of agential life, Black Panther Oakland, its figures, flesh and fire, can be understood as one iteration of those non-humanist humanities, as one site of Black biopower, and for that reason we should take careful notice to the extent that we are able. Thank you.